So we're looking at a new sermon series that we've entitled Monsters of the Heart. And during this season of Lent, we're going to be considering what is known as the 7 deadly sins. We'll look at them over the next 5 weeks, leading into Palm Sunday and Holy Week. So a little bit of history for you as to where these 7 deadly sins come from. It's not a biblical list. I can say, turn to this chapter and verse, and you can see there's the 7 deadly sins. That's not, they come out of church history over a long period of time. So it goes all the way back to like the 4th century. In the eastern portion of Christianity, there was a monk named Ponticus, and he identified 8 what he called evil thoughts. They were gluttony, lust, avarice, anger, sloth, sadness, vainglory, and pride that he said or he found were a huge interference with his spiritual work in what he did. And so he was trying to identify these distracting, oppressing inner things that were happening. So a student of his took those ideas, because he was just doing this for himself and his little group. So a student of his took these ideas from the Eastern church to the Western church, which whether you know it or not, you're kind of a part of that history. And one of the leaders in the church adjusted them a bit in a commentary they wrote on the book of Job, and they took out sloth, and they added envy, and then they made pride not one of the sins, but kind of the overarching, framework of the whole thing. And so then we're moving through centuries now. Then the 13th century, there's a very famous theologian named Thomas Aquinas, and he adjusted them a bit again. He took out sadness and brought back in sloth. I'll give you a sloth for sadness. So he brings in sloth and then replaces vainglory, which was one of them, for pride as the overarching. So his conception was pride, yes, is the overarching sin, but it's still one of the 7 deadly sins. And from that point on, you kind of had your list that we know of today as it relates to the list we'll be walking through. So we're going to be considering these from a few angles that I want to mention from the very beginning, so you kind of know where I'm headed with this, okay? So first of all, we're going to talk about these 7 deadly sins, or monsters of the heart, with an understanding of sin that is not about breaking rules. So in the Bible, sin is described as missing the mark. That's what the word sin means. And it's not just describing bad behavior. Sin is actually more than that. It can be bad behavior. It can be doing something that you shouldn't do, but that's not primarily what sin is describing in the Scriptures. There was a famous theologian named Hans Urs von Balthasar. Big name. I like cool theological, people's names. Mine's a little wimpy, so that's why I never was a great theologian. He talked about sin in terms of resistance to the grace and love of God. So sin wasn't like you didn't do what I told you to do. That's part of it. But sin was a resistance in us, resisting God's love and grace. That's getting closer, I think, to the biblical idea of what sin is. It's a kind of refusal to participate wholeheartedly in the story he's telling in and through Jesus. That's what sin is in the Bible. So this sermon series is not an attempt to guilt you into changing your behavior. By the way, that rarely works. Guilting people into changing their behavior is really not helpful when it comes to the heart. And you'll see why in just a second, because I'm going to draw a picture of your heart for you. Okay? So this sermon is more an attempt to encourage you to wisely examine your heart for something that we're going to call metanoia, which is a Greek word, Anybody want to take a shot at how the English people like us translate this word metanoia? Anybody take a shot at it? Anybody know? You do? Jen, what is it? Okay, it's a change of mind or a change of heart. In your Bible, it probably says repentance. But because repentance has some connotations I'm not wanting to press into, I'm going to use that term, the Greek term, because metanoia is more about a whole change of the inner self, a changing of our mind and of our heart. It's an about face of our life. We were going one direction, now we've changed our heart, and that'll become more important when I draw the picture of your heart for you, because it's not as simple as just a quick whoop, flip of the heart. There's a lot going on in the heart. And so as we change our heart, that metanoia process is happening, and that's what the Bible keeps calling us back to, that metanoia of the inner self. And so we're going to examine that together, and I'm going to encourage you and try to give you ways to work on this. How do I change who I am in the core of my inner self? So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're thinking in terms of monsters. Monsters are deadly, typically, right? But some, although most monsters are intimidating, ugly, scary, mean, etc., like most monsters are mean. Are you guys with me? Or like, what is he talking about? Yes, that's the reality. But don't be fooled, because sometimes monsters can be more cute and lovable than you might imagine. Maybe even misunderstood. Think Monsters University, you know? Sometimes they can be really small, like dust mites. I consider dust mites monsters. And I'm not even joking. I learned that a pillow I had for 10 years, it was my favorite pillow. It was one of these pillows. I don't like the little fluffy pillows where your head kind of bounces. Do you know what I'm talking about? Through the night, it's like, I like to sink my head in like a vice grip. And it's just like, it just holds my head in all night, you know? It's beautiful. And I had this pillow. It was like a 30-pound pillow made of duck bones or something. And I loved it until somebody told me, they read me from some stat from some newspaper that said, if you've had your pillow more than 5 years, 50% of it is dust mites. And I was like, So that's a monster in my book. Eating my pillow made of duck bones. That's monstrous. My point is, they can be very small. If you think of your heart, so this is where my drawing of your heart comes into play. You're nervous now because I'm about to draw your heart. So if you think of let's call the inner self that is you heartland. Okay? This is the land, the interior part of you. Inside this interior self, there's a lot going on. Okay? But I want to identify some key things that you need to understand if this metanoia process is going to happen during the season of Lent. One of the things that is happening is there's this big castle. That's a castle. Okay? Those are those little things on castles. What are they called? I don't know. What are they? Turrets? That's a turret, just so you know. So you have this castle, and this is the castle of truth, or the castle of, the castle of the mind. This is where all the thinking happens, and like it's made out of brick. So brick upon brick are kind of stacked in your mind, and as you learn and grow, and as you read the Bible, and as you are growing wisdom, it's like this castle gets stronger and more developed and takes shape and form in your heart. And that's just one aspect of Heartland. There's other things going on. There's also this beautiful greenhouse. That didn't come out right. I don't know what happened there or why. Okay, that's a greenhouse. Okay? And here, the sun is getting in through the things there. Okay. So this is the greenhouse, and in this greenhouse, there's all these plants and flowers and all this beauty, and this is the greenhouse that is your desires, or the classic writers used to call this your affections. This is the affections. It's where emotions and desires and longings and dreams, they're all cultivated here. And so you have two really critical things going on here. You have things going on with your reason and your mind as that's growing, and then you have things going on with your desires and your affections. And then there's also like this tower, and it's almost like a little lighthouse kind of thing going on. We'll call it the Tower of the Will. And this is like that part of you that's making decisions that impact the rest of who you are. And it's these all interplay with each other. They're not. Your mind is communicating with your desires, and your desires are communicating with your mind, and the mind and the will are feeding into the mind, and the desires are feeding into the will. And so, if you ask the question, why do you keep doing what you do? Well, you have to understand what's happening in your mind and happening in your desires, and that's just three components, really significant components of what's going on in the interior part of you. And so what we're trying to do the next 5 weeks is to understand that this process has a bunch of little, flies in the ointment that we're calling monsters. And that are the urges and the evil presence that is a part of who we are that's pulling us to take this heart and set it up as flagship. That's supposed to be a flag. I'm really struggling with my drawing today. Usually it's so amazing. This is a big flag, and it's causing us to be flag me. Like, this is my deal. This is my heartland. This is all about me, which is why pride has to be the first sin that we talk about. Because the ultimate goal of what we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to not let this all be about us, but move in, draw in to the story that God is telling, that we get to be a part in. That's what ultimately change looks like. An awakening to God's story. It's not about me and my deal and my story and my glory. It's about all these songs we sing on Sunday. Notice all of them go, it's for your glory. But how does that happen? How do you become a person that is moving for the glory of God and not the glory of self? Well, that's why we need Lent. Because we need to wrestle in that space of testing. We need to test our hearts, examine our hearts, and try to move away from this being my big show. Does that make sense? So that's what we're doing. And so these little, and by the way, we're going to come back to this picture. I'll try to do it better next time, but because there's other aspects that I'm going to be filling in to the gaps for you. But I don't want to do too much too soon because I want you to process some of this. So at the center of Heartland, you could imagine, and this is a thing where I would have to draw, you could almost imagine there's like a little mountain at the center of Heartland. And it's this mountain that beckons you to participate in God's story. It's calling you to participate in God's story and glory. Maybe we'll call this mountain like this spiritual faculty of knowing God. I believe that every human on the planet has this in them, whether they have ascended it or not. But inside of us, there is something that allows us and calls us and draws us to know God. Even if we don't understand what that looks like or feels like, it's there. Like every human has this urge in them, whatever you want to call it, to know God, whoever that might be, to know a greater power. Every human, at the heart of who they are, is not really content to have a story that only stars them. That's such a broken little way to live. And so we have to understand, how do we move toward this mountain, toward knowing God and entering into his story and his glory? And I think this season of Lent helps us on that journey. Unfortunately, in this landscape, there is quite a variety of menacing monsters who are bent on chaos in your soul. Have you experienced this? If you haven't, you're not paying attention. It happens in me every single day. So if you think Tasmanian devil is a good example, you know what I'm talking about? You guys remember Tasmanian devil? If that was weird to you, it's because you haven't seen Looney Tunes, so I apologize. Like, what's his problem? Although he's technically a somewhat disturbing Australian animal, but because of the Looney Tunes interpretation, it's a great picture of a monster of chaos because of the, everything he touches, the trees fall down when he comes by because he is chaos, in himself. He is just one big ball of chaos. And that's kind of how monsters work in here. So some monsters are just disturbing of themselves, as you know. Think Frankenstein or the Headless Horseman. They're just kind of eerie and creepy. Some monsters, though, are more forgettable. Think Scott Squishy Squibbles from Monsters, Inc., who famously said, "I'm undeclared, unattached, and unwelcome pretty much anywhere but here." Speaking of being in his mother's house. But all of these monsters, whether they're inconsequential and kind of be pushed to the side and say, that's not really important, all of them, if they're not dealt with, will create chaos internally in us. And so if we're serious about metanoia, the biblical word for that change of heart, and as followers of Christ, we should be serious about that. That's the whole what we're doing here, by the way. We're in the process of change. That's what following Jesus looks like. So what I want to do is together, I want us to consider over the next 5 weeks how we can make some headway in cultivating our desires, in building up our mind, in informing our will, and ascending that mountain of knowing God and his glory. So what would that look like? So the last thing I'll say, and then we're just going to look at a couple texts real briefly that you can just process this week. You can just kind of like meditate. I'm not going to preach them all. We're just going to talk about them, and you just kind of meditate them on throughout the week. But before I do that real quickly, I just want to say we will be considering the monsters in our hearts, and we'll try to see how they're working in culture as well. Because they're not just hanging out in here. They're all around us. They're in the news, they're in the commercials, they're in sports, they're in entertainment, they're in politics, they're everywhere. And so we want to be able to identify them and not just be pointing out all the sin in other people, which we're really good at, aren't we? Like, we can see other people's sin a mile away. They have a problem, But we have a harder time understanding and assessing the chaos going on in our own heart. And so I want us to help each other with this throughout the next few weeks. So here's the text. So if you like to write something down, I want you to write down 4 texts that you can kind of meditate on this week as it relates to this first monster called pride. Okay? There's lots of texts you could think about, but I just want you at least to think about these 4. The first one is really important, and that's Genesis chapter 2. Because in Genesis chapter 2, you have the story of the garden, and you have the fall that takes place of humanity as it relates to their relationship to God. And so it all revolves around this beautiful garden that God has created and has allowed humanity to work as kind of like garden priests within this space, the garden temple at the height of this garden mountain. Okay, I've kind of cast this vision for you from Genesis chapter 1 and 2 before. And so you have these individuals engaging with this, and then we have this disturbing little episode in the story in Genesis chapter 2 where a version of a monster is found to be in the garden. What is it? A snake. Now, in the Hebrew scriptures, the snake is not immediately identified as Satan. So don't let your mind go there yet, because the author's not necessarily trying to get you to think of Satan. That comes later in, theologically, down the road as we put pieces together in the book of Revelation. It kind of points back to this great serpent, and so we start seeing the connection. But right now, there's this little monster that is not over. He doesn't notice that the serpent doesn't come in like some big, there's none of that. He's just kind of do, hey, let's have a conversation. Right? It's more subtle, isn't it? It's sneaky. Exactly. I love that word. So I would encourage you to kind of hang out with this chapter in whole. But in chapter 3, that's chapter 2. Now we get to chapter 3. So chapter 3 is actually what I want you to focus on. So chapter 2 is just the setup. But chapter 3 says, now the serpent was more crafty or sneaky than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, here's the conversation. Now we don't have all the answers. This text isn't supposed to make sense on every level of your rational mind. Like, why is the snake talking? All the questions that you as scientists have, that's not the point of this text. He said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the tree in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. Now actually, she kind of added to what God had said. God didn't say that if they touched it, they would die. What he said was, if you eat of it, you will die. But she kind of adds that in for good measure. I don't know why. That's a whole other sermon later. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. You won't die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. Knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate and also gave some of it to her husband, who was apparently there, the human man, who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves, and then they went and hid from God because he was coming to have a conversation. So the first thing I want you to see, I don't have time to walk through that whole text. There's so much there. But all I want you to see is underneath all those questions that the serpent is asking Eve, and underneath Eve's wrestling with it and her response is this something that we'll call pride. It's like underneath it all. They assumed they had the right and the resources to question what God was up to without having conversation with God. The very conversation where the serpent is asking these questions about God and what he said with Eve, notice it doesn't involve God at all. It's Eve making up these answers and these decisions on her own. She's calling the shots for herself. And you can see the progression where the serpent is kind of leading her a little bit farther and a little bit farther. And undergirding all of that is what we're calling pride. It's this sense that at the end of the day, I don't really need God in this moment. I'm good. I can make this call on my own. I can make this decision on my own. I can figure this out on my own. I have enough resources and wisdom and strength and whatever to be fully what I need to be without consulting God or without needing God. This is the heart of pride. It is not sensing your desperate need for God. Does that make sense? So, pride is deep in the soil of the human heart. I'm going to move on to the next one. Here's the next one, Daniel 4. So here's another one I want you to think about this week. Daniel 4:28 through 33. Really cool story. Crazy story in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's about a king named Nebuchadnezzar who has achieved power. He's the superpower over all the world. Babylon has conquered. They're the number one nation in the world. They've crushed little Israel under their feet. And he has this dream that disturbs him. And so he calls Daniel to interpret it. And Daniel interprets it. And basically he's saying, it's a warning from God, King Nebuchadnezzar. You think you're all that, but if you don't be careful, God will cut you down. That's what Daniel 4 is about. And the story goes that, as Daniel tells it, that Nebuchadnezzar's walking on the top of one of his castles, and he's looking across the world that he owns and that he has conquered, and he's saying, what a great thing I have done. I've conquered the world. I'm amazing. And the text says, at that moment, God struck him down in his pride and turned him into a monster. That's what the text says. He became like a wild beast, eating grass. He went from, I'm all that, I'm the king of the world, to crawling on the ground, eating grass like a cow, is how the text describes it. I think this is a cautionary tale to all political leaders, industrial leaders, religious leaders, like me, who are tempted to bathe in their own glory. Daniel 4. It's striking. And it should be a warning to each one of us to choose carefully those kind of people we want to follow, that we follow humble, broken people. And that we're always suspicious of arrogance and pride that oozes out. This is Daniel 4:28 through 33. So wrestle with that one this week. Here's the last two. 2 Kings 5:1 through 19. Awesome story. 2 Kings 5:1 through 19 is about a man who discovers he has leprosy. And the prophet Elisha is summoned to help this Syrian leader. So he's not a Jewish person. He's a Syrian leader who's actually been instrumental in oppressing the Jewish people. He gets, in his prime, he's this great commander of the Syrian army, and he discovers that he has leprosy. Now, in this day, leprosy wasn't just something you went to the hospital for and got dealt with. Leprosy was a death sentence because your body would literally decompose and it would fall apart on you, and you would eventually die. There's no cure. So, because of his clout and his wealth and his power and his privilege, he summons a prophet, because nobody could help him in his area. So they summon the Jewish prophet Elisha. Elisha comes over and basically says to him, here's what God says. Here's what you do. You want to be rid of your leprosy? I want you to go, take off your robes, and go dip in the Jordan River 7 times, and you'll be clean of your leprosy. Now, what do you think the response to this mighty, prideful general is? You think he's like, okay. What do you think his response is? How does pride usually respond when it doesn't get its way? No, I'm not kidding you. What is the answer? Anger, right? And rage. And he gets angry. He gets upset. Exactly. He gets upset and he says, how dare you? How dare you? I am Naaman. I am the captain of the hosts of the armies of Syria. And you treat me like this? I thought I would give money and wealth and we'd have a big, ceremony and you'd wave some magical thing over me and then you'd heal me of my leprosy. But you want me to take off my robes and expose my leprosy and the depth of my disease and go into a dirty Jordan River and dip in it? No. Absolutely not. Thankfully, he had some friends around him, this captain, this famous, wealthy, prestigious captain who said to him, Mr. Naaman, if this prophet had asked you to do some great thing that would have displayed your greatness, you would have done it right. He's like, absolutely. He said, well, why can't you just do this small thing he's asked you to be cleaned of your leprosy? And so in the text, we see that Naaman humbles himself. He takes off his robes. It shows the extent of his disease. And he goes and dips in the Jordan River, and he goes under 7 times. And the text says that when he comes back up, his skin was like baby skin. Now, as it relates to pride, I think there are moments in our life that God gives us where he gives us the privilege of, in a sense, taking off our robes and saying, this is who I really am. It's broken, it's messy, I need help, I need a therapist, I need medication, I need God, I need something. I just need something. I'm just in need. I am needy and broken. And God gives us those moments so that we can say, God, I need you. And that strikes a blow against pride. That simple phrase, God, I need you. Because the moment you think you don't need him is when you should be most concerned that you are in the grip of pride. Here's the last one, James 4, 5 through 10. Please, if you don't wrestle with any of them this week, at least hang out with James 4, 5 through 10. Because this gives you the rhythms as to what it looks like to live and to move toward humility and away from this grip, this monster of pride. Here's what the text says. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into dejection. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. You can take each one of those lines and just sit with them. And what you'll be sitting with is a pattern that will help you walk through in your heart that surrendering to God, resisting evil, drawing near to God, cleansing our destructive hands, hurting other people, cleansing our untrusting hearts, lamenting the state of our heart and our world, humbling ourselves before God. Each one of these movements is closer to drawing near to God. And that's how we undo this reality of pride. There's one other secret to this. I'm going to give you the secret to how you crush pride, okay? And it's this last little story, and then I'll pray. One theologian said, imagine you're in a bus on a trip like in the Alps, and you're on a bus tour, and imagine all the people up in the front, they're fighting over which seats they want. And the blinds are drawn. So they're driving through the Alps with the blinds in the bus down, and they're fighting over who gets which seat. That's my seat. No, I get the best seat. You get the best seat. And imagine that scene, and then imagine somebody just saying, stop! Open the windows. And so they pull open the windows, and they're in the middle of the Alps. They're like, oh. Now, what happens in the human heart is the beauty and the grandness of the bigger story, the bigger world, actually distracts us and turns our hearts from our own little selfish squabbling for first place, pride, arrogance, vainglory, all these. It turns our hearts when we see the bigger story of what God is doing in this world. And so I want to encourage you this week. You're saying, I don't know how to assess the pride in my heart. I'm not walking around, like a, professional basketball player, like I'm all that, I'm him, I'm not doing that. But I know there's pride. Well, how do I fight against it if I don't even know where it's lurking? Well, I think what you do is you open the windows to the glory of God. And you see him in his glory, and you realize, oh, this is not just a little ego drama I'm in where I'm the star of my own play, which in our culture is a good thing. If you're the star of your own play in the culture, they're like, oh, that's beautiful. Oh, They're the star of their own play. This is amazing. And we're like, no, that's a terrible way to live. We're in a theodrama. We're in God's play, and we get to be a little part. God, how can we be the people you want us to be? How can we humbly come toward you and draw near to you and cleanse our hands and cleanse our hearts and be the kind of people you want us to be? That kind of a life is so much more fulfilling and satisfying than calling all the shots in my own life. That gets small real fast. And so I want to encourage you to open the windows, see what God is doing, see who Jesus is, and be a part of this big drama, this big theodrama, this God drama that he's inviting you to participate in. And as you see that, what will happen is it'll press down the pride in your hearts. Humble yourselves in the Lord, and he will exalt you. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?